Good Shepherd, good morning. Many of you know who I am, but for those who don't know, my name is Kelly Latimore. I'm coming to you from Santa Barbara, California, where my partner Evie and I have been quarantining in a wing of the monastery here after a long journey across the country to deliver a new icon to the Franciscan brothers and novitiate community. I'm honored to be able to share a reflection with you this morning on Palm Sunday. We hope that everyone is still safe and well. And Mother Deborah, Evie and I send our best wishes and hope that you have a speedy recovery. I want to start this morning talking about rabbits, and not Easter bunnies or anything like that, but rabbits from a children's story written by Richard Adams in the 1950s called Watership Down. And the author came up with the story from the top of his head while driving his two daughters across the English countryside. And the story became longer and longer until the book that it is today. But the story begins with two rabbit brothers, Fiver and Hazel, who are part of a small rabbit community, a den. And one night, the youngest brother, Fiver, has a terrible dream. And in the dream, he sees the community be destroyed by these two monsters, which end up being bulldozers who are creating a new apartment complex. But when Fiver wakes up, he has this terrible feeling that his dream is going to come true, that it's a premonition of the future. And so they go to their leader and share this dream with him, but he disregards it. Then they go to their fellow community members and they share the dream with them and the warnings and the danger signs, but they also disregard it. So ultimately, the brothers end up leaving the community, and when they do, sure enough, bulldozers come and the community is destroyed, sadly. So then the story starts with these two brothers, Hazel and Fiver, having to go out into the countryside, into the wilderness to find a new home. And through the course of the story, they end up going to different communities and communities that have formed, rabbit communities that have formed their lives together in a very different way. One community is run by a dictator rabbit who runs the den as like a police state. Another community, there is no leader and everything's free. But in that freedom, they are aware of this farmer who comes and sets a snare to kill the rabbits and use their meat and fur. They're wanting the brothers to be bait for the farmer. Other rabbits are in a little cage behind a house and don't really know what life outside of the cage is. And they're scared to even escape because they've been too comfortable. But within these communities, the two brothers end up meeting rabbits who wanted a new way, or rabbits who have been completely rejected, have been outcasts from their communities. These very rabbits end up becoming vital to the two brother rabbits' journey through the countryside. And so they end up joining these brother rabbits. And it's the strangers, these others, these rejected, the outcast, end up becoming the most important part of the community. One rabbit ends up helping them figure out how to get on a log and cross a river. The rabbits end up finding a bird and helping its hurt wing, and the bird flies up and surveys the land for them to find a new home. But all of this conversation about rabbits, I think in the story, I think is a beautiful allegory and metaphor for what the church can be and what the Christian community that Jesus was hoping would come after his death. And that very type of community, I think Jesus alludes to in his entry. But the thing with the gospel today is that it doesn't quite allude to it, but some of the other gospels do, is that there was actually another entry. There are two entries, and it happened just before Jesus' entry, and that is the entry of Pontius Pilate. And as the Roman Empire had, conquered, all over one of the biggest empires in the world, Jerusalem was one of its conquests. Pilate had the week before come in, and he, as we know from historians, he would have come in on a very large stallion, a tank, a war machine of its time. That behind him would, and in front of him would have been Roman soldiers in their armor, and they would have had shields, and they would have banged them together to make this terrible sound as they entered into a city. They would have carried these large flags which would have had the names of places they had conquered and battles they had won and depictions of it that they were waving back and forth. Complete contrast to Jesus' entry, that Pilate's entry was about power. It was about force. It was about reminding people that they had been conquered, about their domination. And so when you think about that entry, and then literally, so as historians think, a few days to a week after, Jesus comes in on a donkey, on an ass. The Greek translation of colt is actually a beast of burden. So it was literally the biblical equivalent of a tractor for its time. And as he goes through, people, instead of waving flags of conquest, are waving palm branches. That instead of shields being banged and shields kind of leading the way, people are laying their simple garments and their coats in front and behind Jesus as he moves through. Complete contrast. It was simple. It's something that gathering the things that people had around them to create this entry that actually isn't that triumphant, but was actually quite ordinary. But I think the gospel writer is really trying to show us what kind of community that Jesus was entering us into. That it was a community where we're taking the things around us, that the things that have been rejected, as the psalmist says today, the stone that was rejected becomes the cornerstone. We often like to the church likes to equate itself as being Jesus. When we think about the story of feeding the 5,000, we can often think that the church is Jesus handing out the loaves and fishes. But really, we're more of like the people in the crowd and the entry with the palm branches and the coats. We're more of like the disciples in the feeding of 5,000, going around and finding the bread and the fish and laying them at the feet of Jesus, and Jesus alone multiplies it. And so this simple story of rabbits, the rejected ones becoming vital to their life together and making their journey through the countryside, is also the way of the church and the way of the Christian community. That the rejected ones, the widows, the orphans, the stranger, have something to teach us about who our neighbors, who God is, and who we are. That the way of the community is not winning people over through power and force and domination, but it's through a genuine love. It's through that God doesn't dominate us. God isn't coming in and tearing us apart. It's something that's already within us. That it is within the palm branches and the coats and the rocks who are crying out, that are already within us and already within our communities, that are vital for our life together. And so when we think about how lonely this time has been with the pandemic, I know it's been lonely for Evie and I, and I'm sure many of you, that we need to realize that even during amongst all of this, like, there has been sacredness around us, and sometimes it's been in our isolation hard to see. But my challenge to Good Shepherd, a community that's dear to my heart and was involved with, and is that as things begin to open back up, to look more at your practices. That, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say in all the same vein, the German theologian who was murdered by the Nazis, said that if we have a dream of community, our grand dream of community, that grand dream will actually kill community. But the individuals who are actually genuinely trying to love people where they're at will actually create community. So what are the practices that the Good Shepherd already has or can have as things begin to open up that create community in a genuine way? As you're continually doing the different outreach programs, the coffee shop ministry, all of the other beautiful ministries that I remember when I was a part of Good Shepherd, how can those just be made better to aid in the relationships that you already have, but also create new relationships? How can you do more as a parish to accept the people who maybe don't have a home? And maybe that home that they're looking for might not even be in the building of the Good Shepherd, but in a way can be found in new ways of being, new ministries that aren't centered maybe even around liturgy sometimes, but out in the community in new ways. And I think if there's any gift and things that we can glean from the pandemic, as sad as it has been, is being able to look with fresh eyes at the world and new ways to connect to one another, and realizing that the church is made up of strangers, because and that's beautiful, because the church itself is a stranger in the world. That we are called to a new way. It's not power, it's not force, it's just being ourselves. That again, the other may have something to teach us about who God is, about who we are, and who are our neighbors. I miss you, Evie, and I miss you. We send again all of you our greetings as you begin to continue to go down the way. Continue to have more dialogue on these new ways to invite people in, and new ways that in the unknown of the pandemic, as we've already experienced, that the church, it's okay to be in that unknown as a community of faith, that in those places, sometimes are the places when more we see what's around us. We see the loaves and the fishes. We see those palm branches and coats and things that are just already here that we can use to be more faithful people of God, and more faithful Christians, and as we move through the world. So, peace be with you.